morning, everybody. Welcome to Easier Said Than Done, which is our webinar series that we at the Society of Evidence-Based Policing do together with the Youth Endowment Fund, where we have professional conversations about how evidence is implemented in practice or isn't, and try to sort of pull some themes apart around that. I'm Dr. Matt Bland. I work for the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of the most challenging and important areas in safeguarding and vulnerability space: missing children, exploitation, and the risk of violence. So this is missing children has obviously been an issue in policing for a very long time, often viewed on a very case-by-case basis traditionally, and it's been about the process of finding the child, returning them home or back to care, and then closing a case and moving on. But as you'll hear about today from our panelists, and you may well be aware from your own experiences with dealing with the evidence, we've got an increasing suggestion that repeated missing episodes are not, they're not isolated events at all, and often are indicators of much wider vulnerability, criminal exploitation, trauma and abuse, and so on. And the research is starting to really build up over the last decade in that area. But also, a lot of the phenomena that research picks up in other parts of policing, such as crime concentration, is very evident from research in this space as well. It's a very small number of children accounting for a disproportionate number of missing person episodes. And that repetition itself is something that we'll talk about today, and how policing addresses that. The same time, the field, like a lot of fields in policing, wrestles with questions around risk assessment, about hidden harm, partnership working, information sharing, all the good stuff. And in amongst all of that, we're trying to avoid normalising children who go repeatedly missing and ultimately prevent them from coming to harm. We're really pleased to be joined by two people who've got different aspects in this field, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I want to ask the Society of Evidence-Based Policing's newest member, Helen Keshwazadeh, to just put the camera on and say hello. Helen is going to be helping us out as we navigate the rest of this webinar.
Yeah, morning everyone. My name is Helen Keshwazadeh, as Matt says, newest member of SEPB. I think I'm 5 weeks in now, I think. And I'm taking on the role as head of engagement. So trying to get you all to join as members, trying to boost the evidence that we can put out to everybody, obviously to improve what we all do in policing.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. And I'll bring back in the second half of the session when we go to Q&A. Just for everybody, the first half, the format, if you've not been to one of these before, the format is that in the first half, panelists and I will kick some discussion points around, and we'll really invite you to use the Q&A function to post any questions you've got, because in the second half of the session we'll go through that list. So if you've got things that you think we're not picking up, you really want to sort of drill down further in, this is your opportunity to speak to people in the know. But you don't want to hear from me anymore. Let's meet the two people we are here to hear from today. First is Dr. Jess Phoenix. Jess, if you wouldn't mind just telling everybody who you are and perhaps a little bit about your research in this space, please.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Matt. So my name is Jessica Phoenix. I'm currently a principal researcher at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So there our team support our policymakers to make evidence-based decisions, particularly any topic that comes under the Safer and Stronger Communities framework, so policing, crime, criminal justice and community safety. But prior to this role, I was the evidence-based policing lead at Thames Valley Police for a little while, and before that I was in academia, and the bulk of my research focused on the police responses to missing persons, particularly repeat missing children, and domestic abuse as well. So yeah, looking forward to this morning.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Jess. Fantastic. And we have Alan Rhees Cooper, KPM, who is probably the most famous person I've met in this space. So Alan, you probably need no introduction to many of the people on the call, but please tell us who you are.
Yes, hello. So Alan Rhees Cooper, Staff Officer to ACC Damien Miller, the MPCC lead for missing people. He's got his day job to do because he's an Assistant Chief Constable here in West Yorkshire. So he employs me to support him in his national role. So I work full-time on missing people, supporting all forces in the UK. And I've been a specialist in missing person investigation since 2004.
That is fabulous. Thanks very much. You're both very welcome. So let's get the discussion started. And Jess, if I just come to you first on this issue about it came up in your research from 2015, this high concentration of in missing episodes where we've got a small proportion of the people who go missing accounting for a lot of the demand. Could you just give us a bit of background about what the extent of that phenomenon is, what your research said about the extent of that, and where that's been replicated anywhere else in the research?
You've caught me, Matt, on a really old piece, but let me try and think, because actually that piece I think is probably at the crux of the rest of the research that we did. So that first piece came from originally from my master's. It was conversations with the police force at the time that were saying we just have a huge amount of demand related to missing persons, and particularly missing children and repeat missing children, and we just don't know where to start with trying to tackle this demand. So that research initially kind of started with I think following some of the research around repeat victimisation and some of the domestic abuse research around repeat domestic victimisation as well. And of course, what a lot of people will be familiar with, which is that Pareto principle. So having a look across the breadth of missing incidents and looking firstly at demographics, patterns of repeat missingness. And eventually that's where we found you've got this really small concentration of missing children, this particular piece that we're focusing on, led by Aidan Sidebottom, that I think might be on the call. And what we found, which is the same as what lots of researchers found before and after that piece, which is you have a small pocket of individuals that account for a huge amount of demand in this space. When you look at some of the characteristics of those that are repeatedly missing, I think a group that comes up repeatedly, but specifically in the missing children space, is around children in care. And I'm sure we'll come on to this discussion kind of throughout this morning as well. But that small pocket of individuals repeatedly missing, accounting for a disproportionate number of police reports of missing, where we see, high concentrations of vulnerability, be that looked after children, be that mental health, be that risk of or subjectation to exploitation. We've got this pocket of really, really quite vulnerable individuals that are at a high risk of serious harm, that are accounting for a huge amount of police demand. I think that was your question.
Yeah, it is, and that's a really good summary of what the evidence says, particularly and Aidan's in particular sort of gives some figures on that, which I won't try and quote because I'll get them wrong. Alan, to what extent is that evident in the practice that you see across forces, where forces are focusing on a smaller cohort, or is there still this challenge of trying to deal with a problem that is substantial demand, but with a lot of people who are really sort of high volume in that demand?
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful first of all to say that because this explains some of the history. If you think of a missing person or a missing child, traditionally that was a child who had disappeared with no sort of explanation or had run away from home and wasn't intending to come back. Whereas the vast majority of children who are reported missing to the police, they're not disappearances. They haven't run away from home. In fact, they have every intention of returning home in either later that day or the next day. They're temporary absences. And I think for years, there was a failure in policing really to recognise the significance of temporary absences. So there was a feeling, well, this isn't a police matter. That child hasn't run away. They haven't disappeared. They'll come back of their own accord. But of course, around about 2008, we were starting to realise that a lot of those temporary absences, which we called unauthorised absence back then, there was this first indications that some of those children were being exploited. Predominantly, it was child sexual exploitation recognised at that time. County lies wasn't recognised. But there was a growing feeling that suddenly, actually, the police refusing to attend and saying these are just temporary absences or unauthorised absences, that we're actually failing to safeguard those vulnerable children. So I think that's important, because when it's important, I think it's important to realise that we do tend to on police missing person statistics, but there's three things that affect police statistics. One is, of course, the behaviour of the young person. If that young person never is late home, always comes back on time, stays in contact by mobile phone, tells the parent carer where they are, they're never going to be reported missing. So the behaviour of the individual is important. But you've also got the reporting behaviour of the carer. So when we talk about children in care being reported far more often, that is partially because it's a very vulnerable cohort of children, but it's also because of the behaviour of the carers. Carers are far more likely to report a child in care as missing at a much earlier stage when they're late home. So if you think of a family, we sometimes talk about, I think, about how many times do they have to go missing before we recognise that's a problem. Well, it depends, because it could be once. It may well be a parent who's never reported that child missing, and by the time they first pick up the phone and report them missing, that child's embedded in exploitation and is well into that loop and needs really safeguarding. Whereas I also remember a child who was in care, 15-year-old boy, who says, I've been labelled as a persistent missing person and I've never been missing. I've just been late home 3 times when I was with my friends and the carer kept reporting me missing. So it's important to realise that it's not just the behaviour of the child that affects our statistics, it's the reporting person's behaviour. And of course, the third thing is the police recording behaviour and our policies, because there's still inconsistencies on how police forces will deal with premature reporting, where the level of risk doesn't really justify the police getting involved straight away. Some will record all those incidents as missing incidents and deploy officers to go, even though the level of risk is still really within the parental band, whereas other forces will grade them as concern for safeties, they'll close the logs, they won't deploy and tell the person to ring back. So, these are some serious limitations when you're looking at police statistics, because that's only a partial story. There are many children who are repeatedly reported missing who are not really missing, and there's many children who are never reported missing who regularly go missing, but their parents or carers never actually involve the police. So it's a very complicated picture out there.
And that's such an eloquent description of, so in the research community, they call that a measurement validity issue, right? So the data that doesn't tell you exactly the whole story because it's inconsistent. Jess, I just want to come back to you on that point, because obviously you've worked with missing persons data. I accept this is go back some time for you. To what extent did you see that or have to deal with that in your research when you're working on profiling? Because there's a lot of missing persons data to work with, which is very attractive to researchers as a potential source. But what were some of the practical challenges of working with missing persons data?
I could go with 2 ways with this one, but what I will say is from Alan's comment there, something that pops into my head is we did a piece of work quite a few years ago now around return home interviews. And the reason we were looking at return home interviews is because there was a question around risk assessment, risk assessment and how can we make best use of our existing intelligence, our existing insights around these children, young people or adults as well, and use that information when a person then goes subsequently missing, and how can we help to locate and safeguard that individual. And when we're asking that question around how can we make better use of our kind of insight and intelligence, one of the first data sources that was mentioned is return home interviews. So return home interviews, every local authority has got a statutory obligation to conduct a return home interview every time a child goes missing, or if an adult goes missing where they believe to be some underlying vulnerability. Now, when we were doing this piece of research 6-7 years ago now, we did an analysis of a sample of return home interviews, and we thought that the purpose of analysing the sample of return home interviews was to see what data, insight, intelligence can we find that would, I guess, firstly improve the available evidence to police officers that are tasked with the job of locating missing individuals, but also partner organisations that are then tasked with the job of safeguarding those individuals who are at risk of going missing again. And the first thing we found with return home interviews, there was no consistency in the information that was collected. You had multiple different organisations that were tasked with the job of return home interviews. You had local authority exploitation teams, you had local authority children's social care, you had third sector organisations, you had independent organisations. The form in which data was collected was completely different. The level of detail varied hugely. You know, for the local exploitation team, you'd have vast streams of really insightful data, really detailed information about that individual, with specific mentions of indicators around exploitation. And then for some of the other organisations, you'd have kind of loads of missing data, one-word answers, lots of refusals here, there, and everywhere. But something that was really interesting from doing that analysis, as I can't remember the percentage now, but it was quite high. I want to say almost half, but I don't want to quote myself on it. Of the children that had been interviewed in their return home interview didn't consider themselves to be missing. And that was a real challenge then in trying to gather information from them in terms of, why did you go missing? I wasn't missing. I'd just gone out with my mates. I wasn't missing. And that then posed a real barrier in terms of trying to get information from that child that could help to safeguard them or prevent them from going missing again. Because to them, they didn't need safeguarding. They didn't need prevention from going missing again because they hadn't gone missing. And that in itself created a real challenge. The other part of the question that you asked was more about just the challenges of working with police data. And as Alan said, first, we've got the data. Police data always presents, any administrative data presents a partial picture. First, because as you said, we've got kind of the disproportionate reporting of some individuals, particularly children that are in local authority care. And then we've potentially got the immeasurable underreporting of individuals that are disappearing but aren't being reported missing. So we're already working with a partial and potentially biased picture. But then we always found the biggest challenge in trying to use the data is the questions that you want to ask of it. The data just isn't there. So when we're interested in measuring repetition of missing persons, and we want to know, well, what happens to a person whilst they're missing, or what information was known to the police officer prior to them going missing, the data is really quite patchy and inconsistent. In a police data perspective, it's really quite difficult to consistently record risk factors, to consistently bring together existing intelligence from different sources, to consistently record what harm comes to a person whilst missing. That's where we found the data to really be quite patchy. And a lot of this information is recorded, but it might be recorded elsewhere. It could be disclosed to health. It could be disclosed to social workers. It could be disclosed as part of the return home interview. Perhaps it's disclosed in one, but it wasn't disclosed in the next one. And at the moment, I think our real challenge is we have lots of information that's being recorded, but it's spread across lots of different systems, lots of different practitioners. And our challenge is then, how do we bring that together into one accessible format for officers that are that kind of first port of call when a person is reported missing? Don't know if I answered your question or went on a couple of tangents.
No, it's a fantastic answer, and you know, it sort of puts in mind many areas of policing. You'd say this about it sort of, Alan, it sort of brings me on to ask, for the national portfolio at the moment, how much that is an impediment still, but also how far up the radar is it for you?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understood that question, but I mean, I want to build on what's just been said by Jessica Rhees, because there's been some serious limitations over police data, but that doesn't mean to say we can't get anything meaningful from police data as such. So the MPCC sponsored some research, which was conducted by Aidan Sidebottom, to try and get to grips with what factors, if present, or risk factors present, will indicate that a child is likely to suffer harm whilst missing, to see if there are any sort of significant predictors of risk as such. We learnt a lot from that research, and some of the strongest findings of that research was actually how we should be doing the research in future, because we recognise some of the serious limitations as such. So there is only 3 significant indicators of risk across all age groups, and that's out of character behaviour, suicidal ideation, and suffered harm if they've been missing before, if they suffered harm on a previous missing occasion. And I have to say, I mean, I was teaching out of character behaviour and suicidal ideation in 2004, so that's something that we've been very aware of for a long time. The suffered harm when missing before makes perfect sense, because if you're an exploited child and you were raped on a previous missing occasion and you're missing again, it's likely you're going to be exploited again. So that all makes sense. But so you're thinking, well, what do we get from that research? Well, actually, the biggest thing that we realised was this focus on harm is the wrong way to look at it, because only 2% of children reported missing suffer harm, and 8% of adults who are reported missing suffer harm. So it made the national press say, no, the police are going to concentrate on missing adults because they're more likely to suffer harm. It's the wrong way to look at it, because harm is not the key thing, because harm is not always reported. If you think back to all the children that were sexually exploited for all those years, every time they were found and had their return interview, they would not disclose harm. So on the police report, it would go, the missing for 12 hours, 1 day, 2 days, not suffered harm whilst missing. But we now know with hindsight that just wasn't the case. Children don't always report the harm that they suffer whilst missing. Secondly, we don't always record the harm effectively, certainly in the past. So even if there was some hint that they may have hinted that they'd suffered harm, or the child's demeanour, we never took that into account, may have indicated that something bad had happened. That wasn't getting recorded. So that was, that was not recognised either. And the last thing is, our police systems, it's very hard to extract data because a lot of the data around harm would be in free text boxes, not in tick boxes, where you can Compact's great for its tick boxes, and we've heavily relied on Compact system in the past, but it works by looking at tick boxes. So you've got to tick, child suffered harm, this is the type of harm, etc. If you're just saying something in a return home interview and you make some text, you might allude to that. So one thing we did was we've now commissioned some further research through Liverpool University, and we're doing some things differently. One, the focus is no longer on harm. It's on what were the circumstances or the risks that were exposed. So if, for example, a child had gone to meet an exploiter, but the police intercept them en route because we're tracking their mobile phone, they haven't suffered any harm. But the fact that they were en route to an exploiter is a harmful outcome, or would have been a harmful outcome. And that it's an outcome that justified police intervention, because it's the prevention paradox. Sometimes we prevent these kids suffering harm. So the question is not, did they suffer harm whilst missing? It's were they exposed to harm whilst missing? So we're really going to expose that. And the second thing we're doing different is, we can't write a police officer off or police staff to go and get all that data. So we are vetting those researchers, and for the first time, they will be able to access our police records themselves, read all the free text and extract important information that is not easy to otherwise extract. It has to be done by a human. In future, I'm sure AI will have a great place in a role to play in that, but at the moment we need a human to actually extract all that relevant data out of all the free text. AI has definitely got a place in the future for that, but in this current research, it will be done manually by 2 researchers that will spend about 8 weeks just reading police missing person reports, and they will be able to identify those risk factors. And the last thing I'd say about it is not, well, this child's at risk of CSE, therefore they're likely to suffer harm. That's not the only factor. You've got innate risk factors such as ADHD, such as certain vulnerabilities. You've got your contextual risk factors, so we know that child's living in an area where other kids are being exploited and they're now getting associated with those children, whatever. But it's also, this is the crucial thing, the circumstances of the incident, because every time an exploited child is laid home, that does not mean they have gone to meet their exploiter. Sometimes they just go to meet their friends and are in the local park with friends. And we've had incidents where those children have been reported missing. We're going to the local park and taking that child away from their friends and saying, you've got to come with us, and threatening to take them into police protection and use force if they don't, because you've been reported missing. And then we just leave all their friends to carry on playing in the park. All that does with that child is, well, sometimes they kick off and they get arrested, so it can criminalize the child, but it makes them hate the police, hate the carer for reporting them missing, and actually pushes them towards their exploiter, because their exploiters will tell them, nobody loves you except us. Look how the police treat you. Look how you carer, they're always reporting you missing. And that can actually push them towards the exploiter. So we've got to be a lot more clever around our risk assessments, because it's not just what are the innate risk factors, what are the contextual risk factors. We also need to look at what are the circumstances of this particular incident, and you combine all those. So this research will aim to look at all the combinations of all the different things and say, can we put those together to actually say this person not is likely to suffer harm, but this person is likely to be exposed to harm which will justify police intervention.
That's great. No, you totally got my question covered. Alan, I'm fascinated to see when do you expect that research to turn out? Because I'm sure we could do a whole session just on that research by the sounds of it.
Well, it's just started, so it's 12 months. So the workshop is this Friday, when we've got about 16 specialists from up and down the country in the same room with the researchers to start doing identifying the different risk factors and circumstances that we want to play about with. But it's not due to really report until next April. It's got to be done by next April, and the research has to be concluded by April, but the report may not be until June 27. So it's not imminent, but it's doing some things that's never been done before.
Yeah, no, and sounds like well worth the wait. You mentioned risk assessment in there. Would you expect, forecasting what this research will say, but some change to how risk assessment is conducted off the back of this? Or a risk assessment is traditionally in these areas an important thing for policing, because it's where the individual risk lies often for the police officer, right? So what does that look like at the moment, and how do you see that being informed by this research?
Well, the police often get criticised in the sense of our risk assessment processes are considered to be too subjective and not evidence-based. The challenge is we just don't have an evidence base that supports us at the moment and supports that decision making. I've no idea whether this research will be successful and whether it will be able to identify some combinations of risk factors and circumstances that indicate that it's appropriate for the police to get involved. I'm hoping it will. And I'm being I think it's got more chance than any other previous researcher doing that. But at the end of the day, it has to be there has to be an evidence base which has credibility, that the method stands up to scrutiny, because otherwise police forces and individual police officers will just say, I don't trust that. We've tried different kinds of matrices in the past where people have sort of put numerical numbers on, well, you know, if they've expressed suicidal ideation, we'll give it a value of 3. If they've got a CSE flag, we'll give that a value of 3. And then you add up all those points, and then it comes out, yeah, they're now at 20 points, therefore they're a high-risk missing child, etc. Those numerical systems have been notoriously failed us. They just don't work, and partly because you're just transferring the subjectivity from the point of the officer making the decision to the people who are developing the matrix, because there's no real evidence behind, well, why did you give that one 3 points and why did you give that one 2 points? And there's been no evidence base behind to support that. And part of the reason is that the researchers have never really been able to access the data that they need to access, because often the data that we share and anonymize has its serious limitations. So that is why we really need the academics to come and actually look at the data themselves and be able to have really, probe that far better.
Are you still seeing consistency across the country in the current risk assessment framework, or have some forces developed their own systems?
Look, the way it works is there's consistency over the kind of questions that forces are asked. So if you go to the question set that people ask, there's certain questions that are basically asked in every force, and there's a lot of consistency over the questions. Where there's not consistency is the next point of, well, then you've answered yes to these questions and no to those questions. Is it high, medium or low? So we still have some forces that are categorising 40 to 50% of cases. In fact, one force hits 70% of cases as high risk, and we still have other forces who are categorising less than 5% of cases as high risk. So there is a lot of inconsistency in the category that they are given as to high, medium or low. There's less inconsistency in the response, because just because you categorize something as high instead of medium or medium instead of high doesn't necessarily mean that your response will be massively different. Sometimes it is, but it's not always, because I think the biggest cause of that inconsistency with risk categories is around exploitation. Some forces, and we're trying to get this message to say we don't agree with this either by the NPCC or the College of Policing, are still categorising exploited kids going missing as medium risk because it's not a risk to life. And they see the high risk as reserved where there's that kind of risk to life. So somebody suicidal may take their own life. What we're trying to say is if there's a high risk that that child is going to be exploited whilst missing, then they should attract a high risk grading. But that's not a message that we've landed nationally. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those forces who grade them as medium risk are not doing mobile phone checks. They're not doing all the diligent address checks, etc. It won't be appropriate to have search parties, but there is no consistency currently in the way we grade them: high, medium, low, or very low, or no apparent risk. Even some of people are still using.
Okay, that's really helpful. And do you foresee a time when we will go to a more standardized practice around risk assessment and application of it, or is it just one of those? I mean, one of those things that goes across multiple areas of policing, right? Risk inconsistency in the application of risk assessment processes. Is there something in your portfolio plans to try to make this more consistent?
Yeah. So the College of Police and APP is currently under an enhanced review. So we're trying to make certain things clearer in that, so that there's less different interpretations by forces, but also the HMI CFRS has a big role to play. They can be very critical of forces who are categorising missing exploited children as medium risk. And sometimes it's only when they get an adverse report that suddenly forces will start grading those children as high risk. But one negative consequence of that is that sometimes following a HMI CFRS criticism, forces will try and tackle that by introducing restrictive policies, by saying all children under 12 have got to be graded high risk. All children with the CSE county lines flag have got to be graded as high risk. But what that doesn't take account of is that the circumstances should need to be taken into account when assessing risk, because, like I said, not all children who are being exploited go to meet their exploiter every time they're late home. Sometimes they're just with their friends. And if we are constantly grading them as high risk when they're just in the local park with their friends, then that can cause as much harm as good. And it also can move police resources from those kids who are most at risk. So just to give you an example, I can think of one force who introduced such a policy, and their specialist investigation team went from investigating 4 high-risk children a day to about 18 high-risk children a day. They didn't get any extra resources, but what it did mean was that the response to all those kids was diluted, and the 4 that really did need the police looking for them didn't get the same response that they got previously. And so, unless you're going to suddenly throw in loads of more resources which don't exist, you've got to, there's no answer to this other than we have to be better at identifying risk. And that's why we look to the academics to say, if you can give us anything in this research that will help us identify who's most likely to be exposed to risk while missing, then that's great. We're happy to take that, but it has to be credible, has to have a sound method, and it has to be evidence-based. It's got to be based on good principles if we're going to use it operationally.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Alan. I mean, Jess, I'm going to come back to you just with your Greater Manchester Authority hat on, possibly, because I want to talk about partners and the role of partner data in this. We're talking about contextual intelligence here, right? Being something that's important to this risk assessment. It's notoriously difficult to navigate that space. I'm perhaps asking you to lean into your current experiences as much as as a researcher in this space. What advice would you give to people trying to work with partners to try and build out the risk assessment pictures, like either on a case by case basis or, overall if you're approaching it from a research perspective?
Fab, thanks, Matt. I think I'll go to prior hat and then I'll go current hat, but just wanted to follow on from Alan really just to say, I mean, that sounds like a really exciting and brilliant piece of research, and I can't wait, like Matt and like many others on this call, to see that research come out. And just to say, in terms of agreement with, I've always been quite nervous around matrices, indices, scoring systems around risk assessment. I've also been quite nervous around, trying to come up with quite a prescriptive set of these are the five, this is the combination of risk factors or circumstances by which somebody should therefore then be deemed to be high risk. And actually, I think a strength that we've got, Police and other partners, is that we're really data rich. We have loads of information often on these individuals. Our challenge has always been in terms of wrangling that data, getting it into one format, getting it into a place where it can be used. Alan, as you said, a lot of the rich context that would be really helpful to us when we're responding is actually embedded within that free text. So I'm really looking forward to that piece of work. And I guess then relatedly, thinking more from that combined authority or multi-agency hat, I think sometimes what we hear, we talk about, I guess, barriers to multi-agency work in this space or any related space or barriers to information sharing. Sometimes we hear about lack of willingness or cultural differences or risk aversion, defensiveness, which very well may exist in terms of when we're trying to work together collaboratively. But actually what we find is even when you've got a set of agencies who are really, really willing and want to share information, they want to do it well and they want to work collaboratively, we can get these real practical barriers in the way. Sometimes that's practical barriers around data. I say practical, actually, I'm totally underselling the gravity of what we're talking about in terms of alignment between terminology, standardization of the data that we're recording. I'm not saying that we should standardize the data that we're recording, but sometimes those barriers are due to different organizational language. But sometimes also they're really quite practical. It's systems, lots of different agencies working with different systems. And even when you've got really willing practitioners, just not being able to overcome those system barriers or things like information governance, really important to the work that we do. But the size of the task when it comes to information governance and trying to create some kind of framework by which lots of partners can share their information with one another and use it is a huge challenge. And I do think sometimes, I've seen it sometimes, that in itself, the gravity of that task can be a bit of a deterrent to doing good multi-agency work and information sharing. I've also seen examples where it's been really successful and we've managed to overcome that barrier in terms of information sharing and being able to create a good process. I'd be quite excited to see, I guess, some solutions to that coming forwards, in terms of be it platforms or systems where lots of agencies are able to come together and share information on that record level. Not specific to missing, but I know in Thames Valley there's a Thames Valley Together system. It's been a good old while since I've looked at this, but I remember it from a time at TVP. The Thames Valley Together system was a really good example of creating some kind of platform that allows lots of agencies to share information at the individual level, and it was built kind of by and for practitioners in that sense, being able to access that system on the individual and have all your intelligence in one place. Again, it's been a few years, so I don't know where that system's up to the Thames Valley Together. But whilst by and for practitioners and that individual case level, I know the ambitions were also to be able to make that platform open to researchers too, with aggregate level data. I'm sure there's loads of other examples elsewhere. But for me, I think, I forgot the original question, our key barrier here to being able to kind of collate and use that information in this space, be it for risk, be it for safeguarding, is sometimes quite practical. It's that information sharing, even when you've got people that are really on board.
Okay. Alan, I'm going to ask you one more question. Then I'm going to ask Helen to come in and go through questions in the chat. People, please keep those going. This is a horrible question, Alan, so I apologise in advance. But I'm going to ask you to just hypothetically design national missing person children practice from scratch. You know, if you've got like you've got a magic wand to fix some things here. What's top of your list in terms of big problems that need to be overcome or gaps that need to be filled? I'm asking you to probably think a little bit creatively here, and sort of take the constraints off. What would you be looking at first?
Yeah, there's no easy answer. The to improve the response to missing children, we have to be able to, as a partnership, identify those incidents where the level of risk justifies the police getting involved, and those incidents that really should be dealt with as the carers or parents as such, because we've seen the harm both ways. Where the police don't get involved when they should do, and children are going missing for overnight, for a couple of days, and they're being exploited, then we know from history that those kids are exploited and are not sufficiently safeguarded. However, the answer is not to say, well, then the police are going to respond to all. We can't do it. So just to give you an example, I did a peer review at one force, and they did never say no. So if you wanted to report a child missing, they would automatically deploy on every occasion, and they would look for that child and adults, it wasn't just children, but look for that person until they found them. Their frontline officers were spending 30%, up to 30% of their time just looking for missing people, and less than 5% of their time investigating crimes on their workloads. That is unsustainable. We can't spend 30% of our time, and especially as most of those children they were looking for weren't really missing. And with hindsight, they were just testing the boundaries, being late home, they were in the park with their friends. The consequence of that, you'd have thought children would be better safeguarded in that force. The reality is that there was such a negative police culture because our frontline cops knew that they shouldn't be looking for the vast majority of these kids, that they failed to recognise and differentiate between the ones they should have been looking for and the ones who were just really a parental responsibility. And so you get negative police culture. When they find the kids, they're just telling you're wasting police time, we shouldn't be looking for you and all this kind of stuff. And most of the time they were right, that we shouldn't have been looking for them. But that doesn't safeguard kids. So the answer is not to say, well, let's call the police on every occasion and have the police look for that child. We have to, as a partnership, really work hard and get better at identifying risks with that combination of innate risk factors, the contextual risk factors, and the particular circumstances of the incident. And we have to put the child first. So, you know, care homes shouldn't think, well, I want to cover my back. The kid's probably okay, but it might go wrong on this occasion, so I'm going to report the police and pass responsibility on. And similarly, you know, the police have to put the children first. This isn't about, oh, well, let's just reduce demand and stop looking for all children because we've got other jobs to do. We have to actually put the child at the centre, but we need to work better as a partnership in being able to differentiate between those incidents that justify the police getting involved and those that don't.
Terrific. So no national policies that force police into that position where they've got to treat cases.
Can't be done by policy. I mean, it can't be done by policy because it's about risk assessment, it's about risk identification and training. The policies have to allow our decision makers to make decision. So there has to, so obviously, you know, anyone from my world will have heard of the levels of intervention model. That's your policy behind it. It's embedded into the College of Police and APP, where it says, you know, the police are entitled to expect carers and parents to undertake reasonable inquiries to locate a child before contacting the police, unless there is that, of course, real immediate risk that justifies the police getting involved straight away. So if somebody's just seen that child get into a car and drive away, we want to expect the parent or carer to start conducting inquiries to locate the car. That's a police responsibility. But unless there's been that kind of trigger incident, then we would expect the parents and carers to do what a responsible parent would do before ringing the police. So that's your policy bit, but that's the easy bit. It's easy to make policy. The hard bit is actually to train people to differentiate and identify risk and say, yes, it's appropriate on this occasion to get involved, or it's not appropriate on this occasion. So the one thing we do, just to say that works well, is we run some partnership workshops where we take a really missing incident, anonymised, we'll give the circumstances, and we'll present it to people in the room, which are a mixture of police officers, social workers, carers, residential carers, foster carers, and we'll say, if this was your child, would you pick up the phone and ring the police at this point? And then they'll say yes, no, and then we'll get them to look at each other's perspectives, because then you get to know not just how the police think, you get to know how the carer thinks, how the social worker thinks, etc. And we all challenge each other. And so we found that multi-agency training where we're all in the same room discussing real life anonymized cases, just saying these are the circumstances. And then if you know, then we'll throw some more information. Right, the situation's now progressed. You're now told this, or you receive information, or you've had contact by mobile phone, or a concerning text has come in. What would you do now? So we found that multi-agency training helps us all to get on the same page over when it's right and appropriate to pick the phone up and report somebody as missing to the police.
Amazing. I could ask more questions. I'm not going to. I'm going to give the floor to Helen. Go for it, Helen.
Thanks. I feel the same, Matt. Thank you, everyone. We've had loads of comments and some questions as well. I just want to pick up on one point from Susanna Drury. Pretty sure you're from Missing People. Just to mention some research that's coming out, because we've mentioned obviously the exciting research that you've spoken about, Alan. So we've got Missing People are about to launch some national research into harm experienced by missing children. And one of the findings that they're letting us know about early is that children are 2 times as likely to disclose harm to the Missing People helpline or to a professional delivering a return home interview as they are to disclose harm to police officers. So probably one for everyone to look out for. And I'm sure you'll tie in with Alan for some of your work as well. And then we've had some questions. So it's probably a bit of a mix for you both to answer. Let's take Steve's question first. So this one's about care experienced young people. So in respect of looked after young people in registered children's homes who go missing or absent, to what extent can the respective care provider be an essential part of identifying, understanding, and in preventing responding to complex risks that are related to missing, exploitation, and trafficking? So I know we've spoken a lot about covering their backs and when they should call and when they shouldn't. How much should those professionals working in registered care homes actually be monitoring and trying to understand and prevent these complex risks? I don't know who wants to answer that. Alan, do you want to go for it?
Okay. What I'd say is, because in West Yorkshire we piloted the Children Missing and Care Framework, which includes the levels of intervention model. Our issues with our residential care homes have massively reduced. We think the vast majority of our residential care homes understand this, they report appropriately, and they take responsibility for looking for their children when they're late home, etc. I think our biggest challenge is in the supported accommodation sector, 16 to 18, where we'll get them saying, well, we're just really providing support. We're not carers. It's not our responsibility to sort of go looking for children when they don't come back on time. The social workers told us to report them missing as such, and they haven't made any attempts to locate the child, and the level of it don't always justify police involvement. And not only that, there's a big issue with supported accommodation. Some of them are unregistered, haven't registered with Ofsted. The staff training's poor. don't get me wrong, not all. Some support accommodation are doing a fantastic job, but there is also others where the individuals who are in those haven't had the proper training, they don't have the right policies in place. So we have a much bigger issue now around supported accommodation than we do residential children's home, who on the whole tend to do a really good job.
That's great. Thank you, Alan. Jess, anything to add?
Yeah, but if you wouldn't mind me just going on a little bit of a sidestep tangent
Please.
in this space, and it's just thinking about in terms of the identification of risk and disclosures by young people. We know that disclosures by young people can be quite fragmented. They might not necessarily always disclose to police in particular, but perhaps also to social workers or to care home staff. And it's sidestepping a little bit. And again, I'd just be interested to hear anybody who's working in this space and has anything they can share. But there was a piece of research a couple of years ago, a really good piece of research by Nick Fox. I'm sure many on the call are familiar with that work, but just to give a bit of a overview, and I don't know if Nick's on the call. But what Nick did was actually take a sample of child safeguarding practice reviews. So it's almost working backwards in a way, thinking about taking a sample of cases where we know serious harm has occurred, including fatalities, and then working backwards from those. So within that sample of practice reviews, we had there's a sample of those where the children were known to have gone missing from home or from care, or if not from home or care, then to have been missing from school, be that in terms of non-attendance or be it in the form of exclusions. And those that had been missing from home or care, there was a high proportion that had also been missing from school, so being excluded from school. And there was kind of a call in that work for more work perhaps to be done with education, and I guess a question around what is the role of schools in this in terms of contributing towards the evidence base and the identification of risk. So I recognise there's a bit of a sidestep. It's not an answer to Steve's question because Steve's asked about the role of care homes, but I guess it was a little sidestep and an ask if anybody's got some work in this space that they'd be happy to share. It'd be of interest.
Matthew, I just had one thing which just occurred there is in respect to the role of care homes. Look, carers have to be empowered to make decisions. Again, sometimes we attempt to control carers through policies and tell them, well, look, if they're not back by 8 o'clock, then you must report them missing to the police. And that gives no discretion to the carers to decide whether or not on this occasion the circumstances suggest that child's gone to meet their exploiter, or I've spoken to them half an hour ago and they said they're in the park with their friends and that's where they probably are, so I'm going to give them a little bit longer to come back of their own accord, send them a text message, tell them you've got to be back here, whatever. So we have to empower carers to make the right decisions, because we do go to incidents where the carer will say, look, I didn't think I needed to report it through, but I've been told I've got to report it if they're not back by this time. And curfews or times when the kids are meant to be back, it's a nonsense. It's an absolute nonsense. I call it the Cinderella moment. They're not safe at 5 minutes to 8 and then suddenly become a high-risk missing person at 8:05. We expect the carers or parents to do the parental bit and try and get hold of that child and get them back in before you pick up the phone to the police as such, because an exploited child in particular, they might go out at 4 o'clock after school and go and meet their exploiter, and everyone assumes, well, they're safe because they don't need to get back till 8 o'clock, so between 4 o'clock and 8 they're safe. It's a nonsense. We've got to be much more sophisticated on how we identify risk.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. We have had so many questions and comments that we are definitely not going to get to all of them, but maybe if I could put them to all slow time and then we could send them out to everybody on the call. I just want to cover a couple of them off, a little bit more sort of quick fire, if that's okay. We've got a really good comment about trigger plans from Helen Moore. So trigger plans for those for young people who are repeatedly missing. And it's so that officers can have collated information, which should have obviously all the relevant information about risk from all their partners included. And she asks, are trigger plans not a national police process?
Yeah, well, there's a difference between trigger plans and the Philomena Protocol. Trigger plans is the police bit. So that is a trigger plan is for a person that's repeatedly going missing, and that summarises quickly the risk factors and also the priority inquiries, where the police should concentrate first, where they're most likely to find that individual. The Philomena protocol is the process before then, which isn't the police bit, that's the children's social care bit, where they will have that conversation with the child. They will record details of risk factors, they will record associates and where the child, some information that will assist the police to go and locate the child, but they will also include a session around their agreement with the child as to, well, look, just answer your mobile phone, and if you tell us where you are and you can agree to come back, then we won't need to report you missing. So there's like an agreement with the child on their behaviour to minimise them being reported missing as such. But trigger plans, I think, they recognise as good practice up and down the country, and I've never asked this question, but they're so commonplace. I would imagine that every force, if not, will have some form of trigger plan in their processes.
And as
No,
always, I suppose they're only as good as the information that's
they've got
put
to be
into
kept
them
up
and
to
how it's
date.
kept
That's
up to date.
right. Yeah, if they're not kept up to date, then they become a waste of time.
Yeah. So to both of you, then we've got quite a few questions about actually where is good practice at the moment. So one from Chris here says, I'd really love to know if any police and local authorities are working really well together regarding clear duplications of prevention interviews and return home interviews. Has anyone managed to get some form of agreement? Not all prevention interviews need to be completed by police colleagues, and working towards a more relationship-based approach, those that know the child well. So that point about sort of trusted adults is really important. And just to touch on a comment from Kerry Webster, Kerry's sort of the lead for child safeguarding and exploitation in Reading, and she states that in Thames Valley, if a child is graded level 4 for exploitation, they've got an RMO, which I'm pretty sure they call a risk management officer. They are mostly automatically graded as high risk when they go missing, and they come together as a multi-agency partnership, normally under a silver meeting, and they have quite a good proportionate and investigation sort of plan put in place there. Is there anywhere, both of you, you've seen either in your research or in the work that you're doing, that's really doing this well?
I defer to Alan for this one.
Okay. Right. Well, in respect of prevention interviews, there's been 2 or 3 sort of pilots up and down the country, where partner agencies will try and do that police prevention interview and combine it with the RHI, so the child just gets interviewed once or spoken to once. Nobody likes the term interview, we still keep using it. And the last I heard, and it's a good point, I've not had an update here, but Bradford, their children's social care was going to do some of those prevention interviews. The challenges is in the past have been, one, that often partner agencies can't conduct those timely enough, because at the very, if they come back at 2 o'clock in the morning, I think it's fine that prevention interviews waits till 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock the following morning, but it shouldn't wait until the afternoon or the next day. The whole point of a prevention interview is done timely fashion, and often to have that timely response would require a lot of money. There's often no extra funding available for this, but people keep trying it because it is a massive challenge around a kid eventually effectively gets spoken to 3 times. As soon as they walk through the door, the parent will be saying, where have you been, what have you been doing? The police will come half an hour later, where have you been, what you've been doing? And then 3 days later, somebody independent will go and say, where you been and what you've been doing. And the kid just says, well, I don't even think I've been missing, and I've been spoken to 3 times. So we haven't got it right, but there is no easy answers to that. We've had national discussion groups on this, and everyone's got different opinions as to what works best as such. But then just one last thing I'd say around good practice. At our conference in February, we did have Northamptonshire come to tell us about their OPSATing, which is doing really well with first time missing children, etc. I think, you know, they're doing it. They've got some really good stuff going on there.
Yeah, thank you. I was pleased you mentioned Northamptonshire there. We have got lots of requests for things that have been mentioned today, so we will get all of those links for everybody, including the training that you've mentioned there, Alan, as well, and the research that's been spoken to, and we'll send out links for all of those. Back over to you, Matt.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Our time is up. We could have that. We could keep going for another hour, I think. But I want to say thank you very much to Dr. Jess Phoenix and Alan Rhees Cooper. Thank you very much to everybody attending. We will upload the call, and there will be a summary blog. We will do a follow-up email with the outstanding comments and questions, as Helen said. Thanks very much for joining us.